The most humiliating defeat is not when someone loses to you. It's when they lose to the very game they created. Chosen ones, let me tell you something shocking. History proves that every empire, every manipulator, every self-proclaimed mastermind eventually stumbles on their own tricks. Rome collapsed not because outsiders conquered it, but because it rotted from within. And here's where it gets chilling. That same pattern just repeated in your life. The very group that thought they had you. Cornered, studied, and outplayed, they just got undone by their own blueprint. Think about it. These people had entire meetings about you. They made you their favorite hobby, their private experiment, their after-dinner conversation. Some of them were more invested in plotting against you than they were in their own rent money. Imagine explaining that to a landlord. Sorry, I can't pay this month. I was too busy being jealous of somebody else's destiny. But here's where the twist comes in. They thought they were writing your downfall story, but without realizing it, they were drafting their own obituary. Every lie they spun, every trap they set, every scheme they proudly designed only boomeranged back on them. You didn't just survive. You forced them to face the unbearable truth. They were never smarter, stronger, or sharper than you. They were just louder. And now the silence of their collapse is louder than their years of plotting. They can't explain it. They can't undo it. And they certainly can't escape it. You didn't just beat them. You beat them at their own game. And nothing stings quite like being defeated by the very rules you swore you had mastered. Number one, you rewrote their rulebook without playing their game. They were convinced they had you boxed in. They believed their rules were the only way to win, that their tricks, their politics, their networks, and their games of manipulation had no loopholes. But here's the irony. They never realized you were never trying to beat them at their game. You were building something they couldn't even comprehend. While they obsessed over controlling outcomes, you were quietly changing the entire landscape. That's why their strategy failed before it even started. They brought you to a chessboard you didn't need. And by the time they realized it, the board itself had become useless. They thrived on manipulation, but manipulation only works if the other person accepts the premise. You didn't. They thrived on intimidation, but intimidation only works if you fear losing something they can take. You didn't. Every scheme they designed assumed you would play within the limits they set. You shocked them by stepping outside the lines, dismantling the framework entirely. It wasn't about outsmarting them with clever counters. It was about proving the foundation they built on was unstable. You didn't just resist their power, you revealed it was never real power at all. The reason this unsettled them so deeply is because people who build their lives on control depend on everyone else following the script. When someone refuses, it exposes just how fragile their dominance is. That's what you did. You didn't fight harder than them. You fought differently. You shifted the conversation. You refused the bait. You stayed rooted when they expected you to react. In doing so, you made their tactics irrelevant. Their lies couldn't take root in truth. Their traps couldn't hold someone who never stepped into them. Their rulebook became a relic overnight. That's why their loss feels heavier than a normal defeat. If you had beaten them using their same methods, they could have salvaged some pride. They could have said you just played better or outworked them, but you didn't. You proved the entire system they depended on was useless against someone who refuses to bow to it. And that realization is crushing because now every time they try those same tactics on someone else, they'll remember you. They'll remember how it all collapsed when they came against a chosen one who didn't just play the game, who redefined the whole arena. Number two, their greatest weapon turned into your evidence. They believed their lies and schemes would bury you. But what they didn't understand is that every move they made became its own evidence. When people attack from a place of jealousy or hatred, they rarely think long-term. They're focused on the short thrill of making you look bad, of painting a picture that isn't true. But over time, those very lies begin to unravel, and the record of their actions becomes impossible to ignore. What they thought was a clever weapon became a trail of receipts, clear proof that they were the ones obsessed, desperate, and wrong. Every smear they launched was meant to discredit you. But all it did was show just how much time and energy they invested in trying to bring one person down. That doesn't make you look weak. It exposes how threatening you actually were to them. who dedicate so much of their life to destroying someone if that person isn't carrying something powerful. Their own obsession highlighted the truth they were trying to hide. You mattered more than they wanted anyone to believe. Even when they tried to spin stories, contradictions began to surface. Lies have short legs, and over time they can't keep pace with reality. People started noticing the gaps, the inconsistencies, the holes in their narrative. They were too blinded by envy to realize that the more they talked, the more they revealed about themselves. What they called evidence was actually confession. What they thought would destroy your reputation ended up ruining theirs. That's why this defeat is unbearable for them. They can't undo the fact that their fingerprints are all over the mess. They created documents. They started rumors. They planted seeds. They drew attention to things that didn't even exist. Now all of that stands as a permanent record of their downfall. They exposed themselves by trying to expose you. And here you are, still standing, still walking in truth, still unshaken by everything they threw at you. The story they tried to create fell apart, but the record of their attacks remains. That's the irony they'll never escape. Their greatest weapon wasn't just ineffective. It became the undeniable proof that they were never stronger than you. They were only louder. And in the end, even their noise became evidence of your victory. Number 3, they were strategists of illusion, but you were master of reality. They depended on illusion the way a magician depends on smoke and mirrors. Their entire strength came from making people believe things that weren't real. They knew how to twist stories, how to dress up lies, how to put on a performance convincing enough to distract from the truth. For a while, it worked. People clapped, people nodded, people fell for the show. But illusion only lasts as long as nobody checks what's behind the curtain. And when you stepped into the picture, you didn't play along with the theatrics. You stood in reality, and reality doesn't need decoration. That's why you ended up holding the kind of power they could never duplicate. They tried to create a world where appearances meant more than substance, where whoever shouted loudest seemed right. But reality doesn't bend just because people prefer fiction. Truth has weight. It can be delayed, denied, or ignored, but it cannot be erased. That's what shook them. You weren't selling an image. You weren't curating a false identity. You weren't trying to impress. You were rooted in what was real. And the thing about reality is, it doesn't need an audience to exist. It holds steady even when nobody claps. Over time, the cracks in their illusions became too obvious. Lies always demand maintenance, and they were constantly scrambling to patch up holes in their story. Meanwhile, you didn't have to remember lines, cover tracks, or spin narratives. You were simply consistent. That consistency exposed the chaos behind their curtain. The more they tried to paint you as something you weren't, the more people noticed the difference between the illusion they were selling and the reality you embodied. That's why their collapse was inevitable. They thought illusion could compete with reality, but it never could. Illusions demand constant energy, and eventually energy runs out. Reality requires no upkeep. It simply is. You didn't have to match their tricks or outdo their performances. You just had to keep being, and the weight of your truth crushed their illusions without you even trying. In the end, that's why you stand victorious. They were strategists of illusion. Yes, but you were master of reality. And reality, no matter how much people try to distort it, always wins in the long run. They weren't defeated by your effort. They were defeated by the truth itself. Number 4, they thought endurance was optional. You knew it was the whole game. They built tactics for speed, quick strikes, viral smears, flashy moves that grabbed attention and vanished. Their victories were loud and short-lived, the kind that felt good in the moment and left nothing behind. You noticed early that winning like that meant burning hot and burning out. You chose a different path. Instead of chasing applause, you quietly invested in stamina, in small, steady actions that stack up over time. While they spent energy lighting short fires, you planted roots. That patience didn't feel glamorous, but it was honest work, and honesty lasts. Endurance is not about being stubborn for the sake of it. It's about refusing to be defined by someone else's timetable. They wanted fast results because speed hides weaknesses. A shortcut can look like skill until the road gets rough. You knew that real competence shows up when things become inconvenient, when the cameras leave, and when tomorrow is just another day. That's when character matters. They never trained for the slow grind because they never wanted to see what would happen when the applause died. You were ready for the quiet season. And that's the season that breaks them. Their plans assumed instant collapse. They didn't budget for years. Their networks were built on momentum, gossip, and momentum's fleeting friends. When momentum faltered, cracks appeared. Alliances dissolved, stories contradicted, and their confidence became a house of cards. Meanwhile, your steady pace made you reliable. Reliability breeds trust. Trust builds opportunities that stick. It's boring to watch, but it's how empires of character are raised. They didn't respect boring, and that was their flaw. Endurance taught you to manage losses and to learn from them without letting them define you. They treated setbacks as failures to be hidden, which only multiplied their mistakes. You treated setbacks as feedback, small, painful lessons that sharpened strategy and hardened resolve. While they were rewinding and blaming, you were calibrating and showing up again. That consistency is invisible to the impatient, but devastating to the one-time champion who expects the world to remain static. What looks like a sudden collapse from the outside is often the result of slow erosion. Their quick wins lacked foundation. Your slow work built one. When the dust finally settled, their short victories were revealed as temporary noise, while your steady accumulation became influence, reputation, and momentum that could not be faked. You didn't outshine them in a single moment. You outlived them. That's the real win. Durability beats flash every time. Number 5, they couldn't survive outside the crowd, but you thrived in isolation. They built their strength from numbers, leaning on the safety of the crowd, on groupthink, and on collective deceit. Alone, they had no voice. Without someone to echo their lies, their words carried no weight. Their confidence was always rented from the mob. It was never truly their own. They mistook borrowed energy for power, not realizing that once the crowd disperses, the mask falls off. And when that happened, they were exposed as fragile, dependent, and hollow. You, however, didn't have that problem. You were shaped in silence, refined in solitude, strengthened by seasons where no applause existed. Where they feared being alone, you learned how to draw power from it. Isolation was not your weakness, it was your forge. You discovered how to think without noise, how to stand without crutches, how to create without validation. That kind of strength cannot be stolen, borrowed, or manufactured. It is grown slowly and painfully until it becomes unshakable. Their identity collapsed the moment their circle broke apart because their entire existence depended on being backed by others. They only knew how to attack when they had spectators, only knew how to move when they had cheerleaders. You had no such dependence. You learned how to endure when no one was watching, how to fight battles no one clapped for, and how to keep walking when no one cared. That's why your resilience looks supernatural to them. They can't understand how someone who stood alone could still be standing. This is the imbalance they never prepared for. They believe majority equaled strength, but majority can also mean weakness disguised as influence. Crowds shift, whispers fade, and alliances collapse. The power that comes from numbers is unstable because numbers change with convenience. But the power that comes from solitude is permanent because it is anchored in self, in truth, and in the unseen. In the end, this is why you stood undefeated. They trained for popularity. You trained for perseverance. They rehearsed for applause. You prepared for silence. And when the lights went out and the crowd vanished, the game was over for them, but not for you. You didn't just survive isolation. You thrived in it, and that made you untouchable. Number 6, you forced them into self-destruction without touching them. You didn't have to strike a blow to win. Your presence was the catalyst that made them implode. Once you existed outside their narrative, everything they built to control the story began to malfunction. Panic is contagious inside guilty systems. When one person scrambles, the next follows, then the next, and before long, the whole operation is improvising chaos. They started blaming, doubling down on lies, leaking secrets, and exposing internal fractures because they couldn't bear the idea that someone had outlasted their scheme without playing by their rules. Every cover-up required another cover-up, and that chain of dishonesty tightened until it snapped. While they clawed at one another to pin the failure on someone else, they actually illuminated the real damning truth. Their collapse was self-inflicted. You remained unsoiled because you never matched their moral low. Your restraint forced them into moves that revealed. More than they hid. When people panic, they talk, and when they talk, they leave trails, messages, contradicting statements, sudden alliances that look suspicious in the light of later events. Those trails don't disappear, they accumulate like evidence. And the more frantic their attempts to rewrite history, the clearer the pattern becomes. Your silence, your steadiness, your refusal to engage on their terms functioned like a mirror they couldn't handle. They kept looking at each other, and seeing the ugliness they'd been pretending wasn't there. That reflection led them to self-destruct. What's brutal and beautiful about this victory is that it avoids headline theatrics. No grand confrontation, no dramatic takedown, just a slow, inevitable unmasking caused by their own choices. People who build power on manipulation are optimized for action, not responsibility. When the consequences arrive, their instinct isn't to fix, it's to panic, to scapegoat, to fracture. You didn't hand them the matches. You stood steady until their impatience and fear lit the fuse themselves. Your hands stayed clean because you refused to be bait. You refused to throw stones from the same pile of lies, as they tore each other apart, trying to preserve a false truth. The reality you carried became obvious to everyone watching. Their collapse reads like a confession written by their own behavior. That kind of defeat is permanent because it isn't about a momentary loss. It's an irreversible exposure. You didn't touch them, and yet you won completely. They dismantled themselves while you walked away intact, leaving their ruined reputation as proof of the power of integrity over intimidation. Number 7. They invested in masks. You invested in substance. They spent decades grafting identities together like costume designers, stitching charm onto hollow suits and polishing surfaces until the shine hid the rot beneath. Their whole strategy depended on presentation, a confident smile, a scripted story, the right photos at the right events. It worked because most people accept what looks convincing, and they bet that no one would look close enough to notice the seams. But appearances are fragile under pressure. When the first storm hit, all that careful polishing began to fail. A mask can hold for a while, but it can't replace character, and it can't withstand scrutiny. You chose a different path. Instead of rehearsing gestures and engineering an image, you focused on the slower, harder work of building something real. You learned how to keep promises you made to yourself, to show up when no one was watching, and to hold your word even when it cost you something. Substance doesn't look glamorous in the short term. It's formed through repetition, through choices no one applauds, through lessons learned the hard way. That's why it's so easily underestimated. People confuse gloss with depth and applause with authority. When their crisis moments came, their performances cracked. Small inconsistencies, an offense, a leaked memo, a contradicting story began to multiply. Each slip exposed how much had been performed, not lived. Since their identity was built around other people's perception, it collapsed as soon as perception shifted. The mask fell off, and there was nothing behind it. No accountability, no foundation, just a carefully arranged collection of props. Meanwhile, your integrity behaved like an anchor. It didn't need an audience to be effective. It steadied you. Through chaos, earned you quiet allies, and created a resilience that couldn't be faked. The real sting for them wasn't losing influence. It was realizing they had spent their best years pretending to be something they weren't. That emptiness is harder to recover from than any public defeat. You, on the other hand, accumulated something that actually matters. Reputation grounded in behavior. Trust earned by consistency and influence that persists when trends fade. People notice the difference. Because substance shows up in the long run in how you handle setbacks, how you treat ordinary people, and how you act when the cameras leave. In short, they invested in a theater. You invested in a foundation. The theater collapses when the script falters. Foundations stand when storms come. Your victory wasn't just beating them at their own game. It was proving that what they spent a life pretending to be was never real. Number 8, you transcended the battlefield. They tried to trap you in. You refused to let the fight be defined on terms that served your attackers. While others plunged into rumor, tit-for-tat slander, and staged spectacles. You understood that rising above was a tactic, not a retreat. You did not pretend the attacks didn't hurt. You simply refused to let every provocation become the measure of your life. By moving to higher ground, you put time and perspective on your side and turned their weapons into background noise to which you gave no fuel. Stepping above the mud required discipline. It meant ignoring bait, refraining from public shouting matches, and conserving energy for actions that actually changed things. They relied on chaos because chaos masks responsibility and buries inconvenient facts under noise. You answered with clarity, consistency, and follow-through. While they screamed for immediate wins, you built durable systems, reputation through steady work, relationships through honesty, and results through patient competence. Those things don't make headlines, but they endure. You rewrote the rules of engagement by refusing to play by theirs. They expected emotional reactions, scandalous retorts, and headline-grabbing drama. You instead insisted on proportional responses, factual correction, and restraint. That shift forced observers to compare the two approaches. The contrast was lethal to people who chose flash over foundation. Their theatrics lost credibility when measured against your steady behavior. Transcending the battlefield also gave you better sightlines. From higher ground, you could see patterns, anticipate PS, and plan moves that mattered. You could pick which fights deserved energy and which were traps designed to derail your progress. That clarity prevented wasted effort and preserved your integrity. It protected you from rash decisions that would have satisfied anger but sabotaged real progress. Refusing to fight in mud is not weakness. It is a refined form of power. It lets you be selective. With influence, dedicate attention to enduring projects and keep dignity when chaos fades. Others may cheer the spectacle, but spectacles fade. Foundations last. When the crowd tires of noise, consistency stands out and becomes the story people remember. In the end, victory came because you chose the ground. They lost because they didn't realize you had already exited the arena they controlled. You won not by matching their methods, but by making those methods irrelevant. History will remember how you behaved after the noise faded. Your restraint was an instrument. Your future became their empty echo. Number 9. They fed on the applause of others. You needed none. They lived off applause like it was oxygen. Every move they made, every story they told, every attack they launched against you was designed to get claps, nods, and agreement from the crowd. Their confidence wasn't real confidence. It was a mirror reflecting back whatever attention they could grab. As long as people were cheering, they looked strong. As soon as the room went quiet, their power drained out of them. That's because their identity wasn't rooted in anything solid. It was always borrowed from other people's reactions. You didn't have that weakness. You learned how to build without an audience. You learned how to keep walking when nobody cared, how to create when no one was watching, and how to stay disciplined without the comfort of applause. That's why your strength looks strange to them. It doesn't depend on noise, likes, or validation. It comes from a place they don't understand, the silence that tests whether what you're doing is real or just for show. And you proved it was real. When the crowd finally turned away, the difference between you and them was undeniable. They collapsed because their strength was always conditional. They needed approval like a prop to lean on. Without it, they had nothing to stand on. But you were the opposite. You had been standing alone the whole time. Applause was never your fuel, so the absence of it didn't drain you. If anything, it freed you from distraction and sharpened your focus. This is why your victory cut so deep. You didn't just outlast them. You exposed their dependency. You showed that their strength was never strength at all. It was performance. You showed that clapping hands can build an image but can't build a foundation. You showed that validation feels good, but it doesn't keep you steady when life gets quiet. And in the quiet, they broke. You remained whole because your worth wasn't outsourced. You didn't collapse when the crowd left. You stayed unshaken because your roots weren't in applause. They were in substance. That's why you stand where they fell. You fed on silence. They fed on noise. Silence strengthens. Noise deceives. And when the echoes faded, the truth was undeniable. You were complete without applause, but they were nothing without it. Number 10. You were the lesson they never expected to learn. They assumed you were a problem to solve, a nuisance to be neutralized, someone expendable in a scheme that made them feel clever. What they didn't calculate was the curriculum you carried merely by existing. You were not an opponent to be outmaneuvered. You were a living case study that exposed everything they had been avoiding: arrogance, cowardice, and the moral cost of convenience. Their attempt to make you small turned into a mandatory lesson in accountability they never signed up for. And every misstep became a chapter in a course they could not drop out of. Underestimating you was their fatal error because it blinded them to a simple truth. People who weaponize cruelty teach the world how to spot cruelty. Your refusal to mirror their tactics forced observers to evaluate behavior instead of gossip. As their attacks escalated, observers didn't just see drama, they saw decisions. Each choice they made to lie, to exclude, to smear became concrete evidence of character or the lack of it. In trying to define you as the problem, they accidentally authored a syllabus on why their methods were the problem. You didn't have to sermonize or parade righteousness. Your steadiness, your consistent behavior, and your refusal to lower yourself acted like a lesson plan that everyone could follow. People began to compare actions, not narratives. They watched who held to truth and who folded for expedience. That comparison taught them more about integrity than any speech ever could. By behaving differently, you gave others permission to judge differently. You turned speculation into examination, rumor into research, and whispers into documented patterns. This kind of lesson is merciless because it's slow and accumulative. There's no single knockout blow, just a steady accumulation of evidence that changes minds over time. Those who once cheered the manipulators found themselves squirming when confronted with traceable choices and repeated hypocrisies. They couldn't unsee the ledger of bad decisions, and the ledger didn't care about spin. The lesson stuck because it was practical and observable. Align your actions with truth or be exposed by it. What makes this victory rare is its permanence. Textbooks can be revised, but lived lessons stay. The people who weaponized you now carry a permanent record of what desperation looks like. They can try to rewrite history, but history keeps receipts. You became the unintentional teacher whose syllabus is integrity, and failing grade is written in public behavior. That reality is harsher than any public defeat because it rewires reputations and expectations. You didn't just survive their plan. You taught everyone involved a lesson they cannot forget. And that lesson will follow them long after the noise stops. Number 11. You proved that innocence is the hardest armor to penetrate. They believed innocence was fragile, something easy to manipulate, something naive and defenseless. To them, kindness was a liability, peace was passivity, and a pure heart was nothing but easy prey. What they never grasped is that innocence, when tested, becomes the hardest armor to penetrate. It doesn't break under pressure. It reflects pressure back onto those who apply it. The very qualities they mocked in you turned out to be the qualities that shielded you. When they threw accusations, lies, and projections, they expected you to scramble in defense to get dirty proving yourself or to retaliate with the same venom they operated in. Instead, your clean hands became their biggest obstacle. Innocence leaves no fingerprints on chaos. It doesn't entangle itself in deception. So when their schemes unfolded, there was nothing in your actions they could use to anchor blame. Every dart they launched fell flat because there was nothing corrupt in you for it to stick to. They could smear, but smears don't stain what is already transparent. This is why innocence is stronger than any crafted reputation. Reputations can be dismantled with rumors. Appearances can be shattered with doubt. But innocence isn't built on perception, it's built on reality. When examined closely, it stands because it has nothing to hide. That's why every attack they launched eventually boomeranged. The harder they pushed the narrative of your supposed guilt, the more their own guilt leaked out in desperation. They overplayed their hand because they couldn't comprehend someone who didn't need to play games at all. What destroyed them wasn't just your innocence, but the frustration it caused. They wanted to provoke you into proving them right, into matching their ugliness, into giving them something to weaponize. But you didn't. Your restraint became their exposure. Their failure to corrupt you highlighted how corrupt they were. Their inability to stain you made their stains impossible to ignore. Innocence in its truest form isn't weakness. It's unbending strength disguised as gentleness. It disarms enemies not with retaliation but with the simple truth that nothing they do can alter who you are. That kind of protection can't be bought, rehearsed, or fabricated. It can only be lived, and once it is tested and proven, it leaves attackers defeated. Not because you fought harder, but because they could never penetrate what was already whole. Number 12. They played for appearances. You played for legacy. They poured everything into maintaining a look, into convincing others they were untouchable, in control, and always ahead. For them, winning was never about substance. It was about spectacle. They measured success by applause, by how convincing the illusion seemed, by how well they could manipulate perception. But appearances are fragile. They can survive only in shallow light, and the moment they are scrutinized, they collapse. That's the trap they set for themselves. Living for appearances means always living one step away from exposure. You, on the other hand, were never interested in playing that temporary game. You didn't invest in looking powerful. You invested in becoming powerful in spirit, in mind, and in truth. While they rehearsed their roles, you built your foundation. While they craved to be seen, you focused on being rooted. And that difference created a separation they could never bridge. Because when the storm came, their appearances dissolved, but your legacy stood. Legacy is not about how loud people clap in the moment. It's about what remains when the clapping stops. It's the transformation that outlives slander, the lessons that survive beyond whispers, the impact that endures when memories fade. That's what you were shaping while they were posturing, and that's why your victory isn't loud, but lasting. They might have stolen the stage for a while, but stages are temporary. Legacy, on the other hand, is permanent. It roots itself into time in a way that cannot be undone. The irony is that their obsession with appearances guaranteed their disappearance. Everything they built was dependent on being noticed. And once the crowd looked away, so did their influence. You weren't playing for the moment. You were playing for eternity. That's why you outlasted them. That's why you remain while they are forgotten. Your life proves that appearances fade, but legacy echoes. And in the end, history only remembers those who left something real behind. That's the difference between their collapse and your endurance. They played for applause, but you played for immortality, and you won. Number 13. They counted on your silence to break you. Instead, it preserved you. They were convinced that your silence was proof of defeat. They thought the absence of your voice meant the absence of your power. In their minds, noise equaled strength, and whoever shouted the loudest won the crowd. But what they failed to realize is that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's survival. And in your case, it was preservation. While they wasted themselves in endless explanations, constant arguments, and desperate performances to prove their version of events, you stayed still. You didn't chase every lie. You didn't fight every rumor. And you didn't spend your life trying to keep up with their chaos. That restraint preserved your energy, your peace, and your sanity. What they spent on appearances, you saved for endurance. And in the long run, that's why you outlasted them. The truth is, noise is exhausting. Living in constant defense mode burns people out. That's why they needed the crowd to feed their insecurities, to affirm their illusions, to drown out the hollowness inside. But you were not dependent on that. You understood that time has a way of separating what is real from what is fake. You trusted that truth, when left alone, eventually rises without needing you to scream for it. And that patience became your shield. Ironically, your silence was the very thing that exposed them. Without your participation in their drama, they had to fight shadows, invent new lies, and scramble for attention to keep their narrative alive. In doing so, they revealed more about themselves than you ever could have revealed by speaking. They exhausted themselves running in circles while you stood unshaken, preserved by the very silence they mistook as weakness. That's the lesson they never saw coming. Silence doesn't break the strong, it preserves them. The one who conserves their strength, who doesn't waste their soul in battles designed to drain, is the one who survives long enough to win. Your endurance came from not letting them dictate the terms of engagement. And because you chose preservation over performance, you are still standing while they burned out, chasing applause that never truly lasted. Number 14. You beat them by refusing to become them. The sharpest blow you ever delivered wasn't through arguments, revenge, or exposing them directly. It was through refusal. You refused to mirror them. They threw every trick at you, hoping you'd respond in kind, hoping you'd grow bitter, hoping you'd get dirty enough for them to finally point and say, "See, we're the same." That was their endgame. They didn't just want to destroy you. They wanted to erase the distinction between you and them. And when you didn't give them that satisfaction, you handed them the kind of defeat that lingers forever. Evil is never satisfied with winning. It wants duplication. It wants to replicate itself in its target, so the line between the oppressor and the oppressed becomes blurred. That's why they provoked, slandered, and tried to contaminate your spirit. If they couldn't drag you down physically, they wanted to corrupt you spiritually. But you wouldn't bend. You wouldn't adopt their tactics. You wouldn't let yourself become the very thing you stood against. That is what made your victory complete. By refusing to play their way, you reminded them that there is another way, a higher way that they abandoned long ago, and that difference cut deeper than any revenge could. Because while lies can be patched, reputations can be rebuilt, and masks can be replaced, the one thing they can't recover from is knowing that they failed to make you like them. That's the wound that never closes. Your refusal exposed their emptiness. It showed that their whole strategy depended on contamination, on dragging you into their swamp. When you didn't descend, they had nothing left. Their power dissolved because it was only ever effective against those willing to get dirty in return. You showed them that strength isn't in matching darkness, it's in rejecting it completely, and that's why you won. Not because you crushed them with louder words or heavier blows, but because you stood as proof that light can resist becoming shadow. They can deny it, twist it, or scream against it, but deep down, they know they lost because you didn't become them, and that truth will follow them. Long after the noise dies down, the story isn't about chaos, drama, or the noise they created. It's about you. Every point, every battle, every silent moment, every refusal to mirror their darkness, all led to the same undeniable truth. You won without playing their game. You rewrote the rules by outlasting them, by standing in integrity when they depended on deception, by thriving in silence when they relied on applause, and by remaining whole when they sought to break you. Their schemes, their lies, their masks, and their illusions all collapsed. Not because of force, but because they were never built to withstand someone like you. You became the lesson they never expected, the living proof that power rooted in truth and substance outlives performance, influence, and noise. You didn't just survive, you exposed them, forced their own self-destruction, and emerged untouchable. Every attack they launched, every manipulation they crafted only revealed their weaknesses and highlighted you. Strength. While they were loud, frantic, and reactive, you were steady, discerning, and unshakable. You didn't just beat them, you transcended them. Your victory is permanent because it isn't measured in moments or applause. It's measured in legacy. They built for appearances. You built for eternity. They counted on your reactions to validate their power. You preserved yourself in silence and endurance. They wanted you to be like them, but you refused. And that refusal became the unhealable. Wound they'll carry forever. The difference is simple. They played for temporary gain, but you played for truth, growth, and legacy. In the end, this isn't just a story of beating adversaries. It's a story of rising above, of being uncorrupted in a world designed to corrupt, of proving that substance always outlasts spectacle. You are proof that integrity, patience, and alignment with truth are invincible. And while they disappear into the echoes of their own collapse, you remain untouchable, unshakable, and undefeated. If you feel the weight of this truth, remember to share it with others who need to hear it. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay connected to the kind of insights that reveal what real strength and victory look like. Your story isn't just yours. It's a blueprint for anyone ready to rise above the chaos. God bless you.